We see reports of animals going extinct pretty much every week. That's why, for so many of us, national parks and reserves hold such a special place in our imagination. They're some of the few places where you can see endangered species living safely and carefree in their natural habitats. But the thing is, none of those parks actually appeared naturally at all. They specifically follow the protected areas model of conservation, wherein large tracts of land are cordoned off by humans in order to encourage the conservation of nature, ecologies, and animals. But there's a catch here. If we're going to clear out large tracts of land to create protected areas, then what actually happens to all the people who are living on that land? Where are they supposed to go? The reality is that while protected areas might seem to actually protect the rights of animals or nature, they really do very little to protect the rights of the indigenous communities who've been living on these lands for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Take these figures for example. Between 1988 and 2020, the number of protected areas in India increased from 67 to 870. That sounds pretty good for the future of endangered species. However, at the same time between 1999 and 2020, over 13,450 families across the country were evicted from the same lands that were about to be protected. Many of these evictions from their homes happened forcefully, some brutally. So, whose interests are these parks actually serving? Why do they exist at all? These are the questions that are answered in part by Losing Ground. Losing Ground is a new interactive map which has been produced by the Environmental Justice Atlas and Kalpavriksha, which is an NGO based out of India. The map is a product of over 3 years of extensive fieldwork with communities on the ground, activists, and other NGOs as well. It provides a first of its kind, in-depth review of each conflict within the protected area. It discusses the actors, the organizations involved, the outcomes, and the future directions of the conflict as well. It's an invaluable tool for researchers, activists, and communities looking to understand the different ways in which India's conservation model has failed so many families across the country. We spoke to the people who created this map at Kalpavriksha and Environmental Justice Atlas to understand more about what they did and why they did it.
The assumption has been the last one, that every human wildlife interaction is necessarily negative and conflict ridden. And that's the premise on which our conservation policies are based on. So it is not surprising that in the last few decades, particularly since the Wildlife Protection Act came about in 1972, there has been huge human-wildlife conflicts, more to say human and wildlife conservation administration conflicts. Like a study suggested in 2009 that Kalpavriksha carried out, that it is estimated that about 100,000 to 600,000 people were relocated, displaced in just 2 decades of the Wildlife Protection Act coming about. And this is in addition to all the other restrictions, human rights violations, and atrocities that communities were facing who were still inside these protected areas. And since the 2009 study, these violations have not stopped. These displacements have not stopped. The news about these displacements has been continuously pouring in. And yet it is surprising that there is no official systematic data on exactly how many people actually live in these protected areas, what kind of interaction or dependence do they have with these natural resources, how many people are estimated to be displaced, why, and how many have already been displaced. And in cases where the displacements has happened, there is no data on what is the state, what has it resulted into, what is the status of the people that have been displaced, or what is the condition of the wildlife from where these have been displaced. There are just minuscule level of studies on that. There have very often been complaints about these violations, but often in the absence of data or ground level evidence, these complaints are not taken up and no action is taken upon them. In addition to that, in 2006, as many of you may be aware of, that after a huge grassroots level movement, Forest Rights Act of India was implemented, and it was because the act provided for rights of the local people, provided for very specific clarification and prerequisite for displacement. The hope was that this would lead to a positive change towards a more democratic and inclusive forms of wildlife conservation in India. But there was no assessment even a decade after as to what extent it has been used and how it has benefited or not in these situations. So this map in a way is a step towards beginning to create this evidence, hopefully with the involvement of a lot of other people across the country over a period of time, to start generating this evidence, this data publicly and making it publicly available.
When we started this study in 2017, we really wanted to understand what was going on inside protected areas. We were really interested to understand what was the process of implementation of the Forest Rights Act in protected areas. But when actually we went into the field, we really saw that the issues which are more complex. So one of the objectives also of this map it is actually to document the resistance that there are inside these protected areas and how local communities are struggling both against the continuous threat of displacement and against the strict conservation policies. We had data on criminalization of local communities, highlighting some cases of violence and harassment of local communities, mostly also against women. And also we had data concerning the militarization that is going on inside and around these protected areas. And also very important on some geographical data that we had to show how these protected areas have actually expanded. And expansion of protected areas from 1985 to 2020, as well as other conservation spaces, such as wildlife corridors and so-called tiger landscape, which are spaces where, according to the government of Indian studies, are spaces where in 10 years, the number of tiger will be doubled. So what is very interesting in our map to see is also that all the conflicts, most of the conflicts that we have documented, that are actually around these spaces. So this kind of suggests how the restrictive policies for tiger protection are also increasing the conflicts with the local communities.
If you just look at the tiger conservation plans, you'll see that every relocation process has been a success. People are enjoying the benefits. Wildlife is doing great. Everyone is happy. But if you look at the on-ground perspectives, it completely contradicts what has been mentioned in the tiger conservation plans. And that information, we felt that there is a need to bring out that information. And so the idea was to begin with 30 protected areas, looking at these certain issues. As time moves on, we add in more information on more protected areas, and more issues are taking into account the perspectives of local communities, organizations who have been working in and around these issues and in and around these areas.